Raymond Kessler was 31 years old on October 14, 1971, working second watch at a fenced Army storage annex outside a small town in eastern Colorado. He carried a clipboard, a revolver he'd never fired, and coffee gone cold by 10 o'clock. At 11:52 that night, a fault in the perimeter relay sealed the inner door of Building 9. Sealed it, the maintenance log says, for 6 minutes. Kessler says he was inside when it sealed. He says he was inside it with something that was not human, and that the 6 minutes on the log and the 6 minutes he lived through were not the same 6 minutes at all. He kept the difference to himself for 41 years. In 2012, in a kitchen in Nebraska, he used a word for the first time in front of a recorder. A word for what the thing had done to him in that room. A word, he said, described a feeling rather than an action. He called it reading. Reading how? He says it did not attack him. It did not speak. It read him, he says, the way you would read a gauge or a page or a pulse under two fingers. Not 41 years of forgetting. 41 years of choosing every single day not to say it. I think the choosing matters more than the memory does. What remains of that night fits in a single banker's box, and I have gone through it more than once. There is a photocopy of the Building 9 maintenance log, the original long since transferred and, according to the transfer slip, never received at the other end. There is Kessler's own incident report, 4 handwritten pages, unsigned, never filed with his supervisor. He kept it instead, folded into the lining of an old Bible, for 4 decades. There is a single Polaroid taken by the guard on the outer post that night, showing Building 9's door from 40 feet away, closed, ordinary, nothing in the frame but a door. And there is a wristwatch, a Timex with a cracked crystal, stopped at 12:04. Kessler wore it the night he went into that building. He was still wearing it, unwound and unrepaired, when I spoke to his daughter in 2019. 4 objects: a log, a report, a photograph, a watch. None of them proves anything on its own. I want to be careful here. But I want you to hold all 4 in your head before we go any further, because I am going to come back to each of them separately, and not in the order you would expect. Let me start not with the word he used later, but with the walk. Second watch at the annex ran from 10 at night until 6 in the morning, and Kessler's route took him past Building 9 9 times a shift. A squat cinder block structure with no windows, used, as far as any of the guards were told, for surplus quartermaster stock. At 11:52, he was on his 8th pass. He says the exterior floodlight over the door was flickering, which was not unusual, except that it was flickering in a pattern. 3 quick pulses, a pause, 3 quick pulses again. The kind of rhythm a faulty bulb does not produce on its own. He stopped to look at it. That was his mistake, if it was a mistake. The door was standing open 6 inches, which it was never supposed to do. And there was a smell coming through the gap that he could not place at the time and spent years afterward trying to name. Not chemical exactly, not electrical exactly. Something like a struck match held underwater. He pushed the door the rest of the way open to secure it. That is the last ordinary thing he remembers doing. Inside, the light was wrong before he understood why. Not off, not flickering. Wrong. A flat, shadowless gray that came from no fixture he could locate. The kind of light that makes a room look photographed rather than lit. And it was cold in a way the season didn't explain. An October cold, but specific, localized. The way a walk-in freezer is cold and a hallway outside it is not. He says he could feel the line where the cold started, a threshold in the air itself, 4 or 5 feet inside the door. He crossed it. And that is when the relay faulted and the door sealed behind him. And that is when he saw it, standing near a stack of crates that were not stacked the way quartermaster crates are stacked, which is to say, not stacked at all, but arranged in a loose circle, as though something had been walking around them. Arranged. He describes the figure the way men who are not given to description tend to describe extraordinary things. Flatly, and with more precision on the small points than the large ones. About 4.5 feet. Head disproportionate to the body, wider at the temple than a human skull has any reason to be. Skin the color of wet slate. No visible seam of clothing. No visible breath in air cold enough that his own breath was showing in front of him. And the eyes. Kessler is specific about this, more specific than about anything else in the room. Were not black the way people always say. Not glass. Not wet. He said they looked dry. He said, like a moth's wing. That same kind of dry. That same kind of dust. And I want to flag that comparison, because it is the kind of detail a person does not invent under pressure. Fear does not reach for moth wings. Fear reaches for the nearest available horror. And Kessler, in that room, reached instead for something oddly precise, oddly small, oddly domestic. A grown man locked in a sealed building with something he could not name chose, when asked to describe its eyes 50 years later. To compare them to an insect he must have handled 1,000 times as a farm kid in Nebraska. That's not embellishment. That's memory doing what memory does when it's telling the truth, reaching for what it actually has on hand. Here is where the 6 minutes stop making sense. The maintenance log, and I have the photocopy in front of me, records the relay fault beginning at 11:52 and resolving at 11:58. 6 minutes. Kessler was debriefed the next morning by his supervisor, given a written warning for failing to report a door malfunction promptly, and sent back to work. Nobody at the time thought 6 minutes was worth investigating. Kessler did not correct them. He told me, close to verbatim, that he stood in there with it for over an hour, maybe more. That he knows what 6 minutes feels like, because he's stood plenty of 6-minute posts. And that this was not that. He is not vague about the discrepancy. He is exact about not being able to be exact. He places his experienced time somewhere between 70 and 90 minutes, and he has never moved off that range in 4 decades. 90 minutes inside 6. That is the gap this story keeps returning to. And I'm going to ask you to hold on to both numbers, because before the end of this, you will hear them again, and the space between them does not get smaller. When the door finally released, and by his account it simply released the way it had sealed, without warning, Kessler found himself back near the entrance. No memory of crossing the intervening space. No memory of the figure moving or speaking or touching him. He says the last clear image he has is of standing very still near the crates, and the next clear image is of standing very still near the door, as though someone had cut the reel and spliced 2 later frames together. In between, nothing. Not blackness, not sleep. He was careful with me about that distinction. It wasn't like passing out, he said. It was like being somewhere and then being somewhere else, and not having a somewhere in between. His watch had stopped at 12:04, 12 minutes after the log says the relay resolved. He noticed it that same night, tapped the crystal, assumed the cold had killed the movement, and did not think about it again for 38 years. Until a jeweler in Lincoln, examining it in 2009 as a favor, told him the movement hadn't stopped from cold or shock. It had stopped from magnetism. Something had passed close enough to that watch to disrupt the escapement, the jeweler said. And whatever it was, had done it cleanly, without denting the case or cracking the crystal any further than a factory flaw already had. I'll come back to that watch. I want you to remember the number on its face. There is also the matter of the door itself. Specifically, a mark on the inside of it, at roughly shoulder height, that the outer post guard on duty that night, a man named Wallace Pruitt, mentioned to Kessler only once, years later, at a reunion neither of them had planned to attend. Pruitt said he'd gone in the next morning to look at the malfunctioning relay and noticed a print on the door's interior paint. Not a handprint exactly, 4 long marks and no visible thumb, pressed in rather than smudged on, as though something had leaned on the door from the inside while it was still soft, with fresh paint that had, in fact, been dry for over a week. Pruitt photographed nothing. He mentioned it once, uncomfortably, and never again. I'll come back to him, too. Pruitt is the first of 3 people whose accounts I want to lay beside Kessler's. And I want to say plainly, before I go further, that none of these 3 ever compared notes with each other in any organized way. Pruitt gave his account to a local newspaper reporter in 2015, 3 years after Kessler spoke into a recorder in that Nebraska kitchen. And there is no indication either man knew the other had gone on record. Pruitt's contribution is small, and it is exactly this. He remembers the floodlight over Building 9 pulsing in 3s that night. The same 3-pulse pattern Kessler described independently, a detail Pruitt had never heard Kessler mention, because Kessler, by his own account, had never told anyone about the light until years after Pruitt gave his own interview. 2 men, 2 separate recordings, 3 years apart, describing the same broken rhythm in the same bulb. That is not proof of anything extraordinary. A light can flicker in 3s for purely electrical reasons. But it is the kind of small, mundane, unglamorous detail that liars tend not to bother inventing, because it does nothing for the story. Liars reach for drama. Pruitt reached for a light bulb. The second account belongs to a physician, Dr. Alma Voss, who examined Kessler 11 days after the incident, not for anything related to Building 9. Officially, there was nothing to relate it to, but for a routine flight physical ahead of a transfer that never happened. Voss's notes, preserved by her family and shared with me by her granddaughter, record an anomaly she flagged but could not explain. Elevated calcium deposits in the soft tissue along both of Kessler's forearms, symmetrical, shallow, resembling nothing she had seen before or would see again in 30 years of practice. She wrote a single line in the margin of the chart, not part of the official notes. Pattern suggests directed exposure. Source unclear. She never spoke to Kessler about Building 9. She had no reason to connect the two. She died in 1994, and her granddaughter found the chart only while clearing out a filing cabinet in 2016, a cabinet that had been moved twice and nearly discarded once, and which contained, alongside Voss's decades of ordinary patient files, nothing else remotely like it. The third account is closer to home. Kessler's daughter, Denise, was 11 in 1971 and remembers nothing of the incident itself. Her father never spoke of it in front of his children. But she remembers, and has remembered consistently since long before her father ever went on record, that he could not sit in a room with his back to a closed door for the rest of his life. Restaurants, church, his own living room. He would rearrange furniture, arrive early to claim a seat, once stood through an entire wedding rather than sit where the only open chair put a door behind him. She told me one more thing, offered almost as an aside, that when she was 14, she once heard her father say something in his sleep, only once, and never told anyone until now. He said, "Stop reading me." She had no context for it. It would be another 2 decades before she heard her father use that same word awake, in front of a recorder, to describe what happened in that building. She did not connect the two moments until this project reached out to her in 2019. Two accounts, 2 decades apart, and the same word between them. Kessler chose it consciously in 2012, sitting in front of a recorder. His daughter heard him use it unconsciously, in his sleep, sometime in the late 1980s, long before either of them had any reason to compare notes, because Denise never told her father what he'd said. 2 witnesses, 2 decades, the same word. What happened to the paper trail is, in its way, the most consistent part of this whole account, because nothing about it is dramatic. The original maintenance log for Building 9, the one the photocopy in my banker's box was taken from, was transferred to a regional records office in 1973 as part of a routine consolidation of the annex's files ahead of its decommissioning. The transfer slip survives. The log itself does not. Or rather, the records office has a folder with the correct case number, the correct date range, and 11 of what should have been 14 pages. 3 pages are simply absent, and nobody I have spoken to can say when they went missing, only that they were already gone by the first inventory taken after the transfer. Kessler's own incident report was never filed at all. He kept it, which is the only reason it exists in any form today. And there is one more figure I should introduce here, a woman named Corwin Adair, a civilian records clerk who worked at that regional office from 1974 until her retirement in 2003, and who, unofficially, on her own time, kept a private notebook of what she called orphaned files, case numbers with gaps in them, folders that didn't match their own inventories. Building 9's file was one of 11 she flagged over 3 decades. She never published anything. She gave her notebook to a local historical society 2 years before she died, where it sat uncatalogued until a graduate student found it in 2018 while researching something entirely unrelated. None of this, taken piece by piece, is remarkable. A stopped watch, a light that flickers in threes, a mark on a door, a margin note in a dead doctor's chart, 3 missing pages in an 11-page folder. Any one of these alone is the kind of thing that happens in ordinary buildings for ordinary reasons. And I have spent real time trying to find the ordinary reason for each one separately. I haven't been able to rule any of them out individually. That proves nothing. But this is not 5 isolated oddities sitting next to each other by coincidence. This is a cluster. And a cluster is a different kind of object than a coincidence is. Coincidence has no shape. A cluster does. And once you start looking at what accumulates around one sealed door on one October night in 1971, it becomes very hard to keep insisting, 5 separate times, that nothing is there. I keep returning to that word, reading, because of what it refuses to be. It is not seeing. Seeing implies a witness, a subject looked at, and a viewer looking. 2 parties facing each other across a gap. Reading is not symmetrical in that way. A book does not know it is being read. A weather instrument does not consent to the gauge. To read something is to extract what it contains without needing it to participate, without needing it to even be aware that extraction is occurring. That is what Kessler describes, consistently, across 4 decades and in 2 different states of consciousness: waking testimony and unguarded sleep. Not fear of being harmed, fear of being available. Of being the kind of object that yields information simply by existing in a room with something that wanted it. I want to be careful here, because this is the part of the story that tempts a person toward certainty, and I don't have certainty to offer. What I have is a question I think is worth carrying past this video. What would it mean to be known by something that never had to ask you a single thing? We build our entire sense of privacy around the idea that knowledge of a person requires that person's participation. A conversation, a confession, a glance returned. Kessler's account describes an intelligence, if that is the right word, that apparently required none of that. It stood near some crates, and it was, by his account, finished with him in less time than it takes to explain what happened, whatever that time actually was. 90 minutes or 6. The gap between those numbers might be the most honest thing in this entire story, because it suggests that whatever he experienced did not run on a clock that cared what our clocks say. Which brings me back to the watch. I told you I would. 12 minutes passed when the log says the door released. 12:04. Stopped by magnetism strong enough to disrupt a sealed movement without marking the case. I used to think that number was simply evidence that something with a strong field had been near him. I no longer think that's the interesting part. The interesting part is that 12:04 falls inside neither number Kessler gives you. Not inside the 6 minutes the log claims. Not inside the 70 to 90 minutes he remembers living through. It sits in a third position entirely. 12 minutes past a resolution that, by his own account, hadn't happened yet from where he was standing. 12 minutes, unexplained. I don't have a clean explanation for that. I have a watch, stopped at a time that fits no version of the story, kept for 38 years by a man who could have thrown it away and never once did. I am not prepared to tell you that Raymond Kessler was examined by something not of this earth in a sealed cinder-block building in 1971. I am not prepared to dismiss it either. What I can tell you is that a security guard, a physician who never knew she was corroborating anyone, an outer post guard who mentioned a door frame once and never again, an 11-year-old girl who overheard 2 words in the dark, and a records clerk who kept a private list of orphaned files for 30 years, all left behind fragments that point, without ever having been arranged to point, in the same direction. I have spent a long time now sitting with this account, longer than I expected to when I started, and I have not found the ordinary explanation that dissolves all 5 fragments at once. I have only found ordinary explanations for each one alone, which is not the same thing. So I am left with the objects, the way I started. A photocopy with 3 pages missing. A doctor's margin note nobody was meant to read but her. A door with a mark in dry paint that photographed nothing because nobody photographed it. A watch stopped at a time that belongs to no version of the story anyone has told me. And a man who rearranged furniture in every room he ever sat in for the rest of his life, so that no door was ever again behind him without his permission. I think about the 6 minutes and the 90 minutes, and how neither one of them is wrong exactly, only true from 2 different places that were somehow occupying the same sealed room. I think about a girl of 14 hearing her father say 2 words in his sleep and carrying them, unexplained, for 26 years before they meant anything at all. What was in that circle of crates before he crossed the cold line in the air? What does it mean that his watch stopped at a time inside neither number? Where did 3 pages go? And did anyone ever read them before they went? Denise still checks, out of habit more than hope, that the front door of wherever she's sitting is somewhere she can see. Raymond Kessler is 86 now. He still won't sit with his back to a closed door. He told me once that he isn't afraid of the door itself. He said he's afraid of what a door means it can do without asking him first. He keeps the watch in a drawer, stopped